Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. We're going to dive into our session 2 now. We're going to transition a little bit. The purpose of the first session was really to try to emphasize why it's important to make equity kind of a central consideration as part of climate adaptation efforts. And in this next session, we're going to transition and hear about some research that's been done on how to do that in a couple of different contexts. So before I introduce those speakers, Amar Cid, I see that you've joined us as a panelist. We didn't have a chance to connect, but I wanted to see if you wanted to take a couple of quick minutes to talk about your work at CORE, because we were going to try to do that at this point in the agenda. And if not, that's okay. I don't want to put you on the spot.
Oh yeah, no, that's quite all right.
Great.
All right. Hello, everybody. All right. So my name is Amar Cid. I'm the program manager for the Caltrans Office of Race and Equity. We have been in existence for a little over a year, and I have been with this program and in this role actually a year next week. So very exciting to be here. And leading into the second session, we thought it was appropriate to talk about some of the work that you may all be familiar with, which is the equity index that we're developing. And so the equity index and the purpose for this equity index is so that Caltrans can really look towards a way to identify communities that are underserved or burdened by our transportation systems, utilizing different indicators, kind of grouping them around environmental, accessibility, and socioeconomic. We want to build this indicator tool, utilizing different layers and mapping them together with the weighted indices to produce a score that would help us really look at the equity-based communities and identifying those equity-based communities. So if you're familiar with CalEnviroScreen, that is kind of what we're looking to build out, where we would have this interface where you can kind of look at the different indicators of why a particular area may be considered equity-based, or look at the different transportation burdens, or look at the different environmental burdens that make up that particular area. We're kind of looking at this very specific to transportation, because CalEnviroScreen, if you're aware of, doesn't necessarily have a whole lot of transportation-based indicators. And so we need a system in a kind of a mapping way to prioritize our funds, to really prioritize who we're going to start engaging with and who make up those underserved or priority-based populations. Over the next several months, we're going to be doing an engagement process. We're going to break it up into a couple of different areas. We're going to work with our public and our community-based organizations, working with different state agencies who are already developing their own indicators or their own equity type tools for their specific realm of work, and then also working with our tribal governments and our tribal communities to see if these indicators are conducive to what they are envisioning, to how we would identify communities, and then how we would start looking to prioritize funds and projects. Let's see, what else? Some of the indicators that we're looking at right now for this system is looking at different spaces from the American Community Surveys, where we have data already. So we're looking at the percent of poverty, we're looking at the transportation and housing balance, the rate of asthma, diesel particulate matter. We're going to be pulling some of the serious fatalities that we already have from Caltrans. This kind of work started earlier this year. We kicked off a large internal working group. So we have about 50 members throughout Caltrans that are supporting the development of this equity indicator. More recently, we have 2 members that were brought on, Afi and Kedan, to really kind of propel this project forward. So Afi is going to be taking the lead on developing the actual tool, kind of looking at all our data sets, organizing our data sets, and then Kedan is going to be working towards our engagement practice. So I think as we move through this, our goal is to have something piloted over the summer with a full launch in the fall. So really excited. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact myself or my staff. And then also, if you're interested in further developing this with our working group already, please hit us up and we can see how you can get involved. The thought process here is that this tool would be developed for Caltrans and transportation groups so that we can use this and we can start looking at all of our investments and all of our strategies going forward. I think that is it for me. So maybe we can kick off this next session. I can pass it back over to you, Mike.
Great, thanks so much, Amar. And that's I think really timely in terms of what we're going to be hearing about next in evaluating how we can build equity considerations into project prioritization and things like that. So we're going to have a series of two 20-minute presentations followed by a Q&A session now. Just a reminder, please go ahead and enter your questions into the Q&A box at any time. We're first going to hear from Dr. Suwan Shen and Dr. Karl Kim, who are both faculty in the Urban and Regional Planning Department at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. They're our partners through the Pacific Southwest Region University Transportation Center, so we're thrilled that they are joining us. And they're going to talk about their work on flooding and disaster response. So Dr. Shen, I believe you're kicking us off. I will share my screen and you can take it away.
Thank you, Mac, for the introduction. I'm Suwan Shen. I'm going to present our research on assessing transportation system vulnerability to tidal flooding here in Hawaii. And my co-author, Karl Kim, will present other projects related to applications, consider equities in other different settings. Next slide. Great to have the opportunity here to share our research. So we focus on tidal flooding because, as you can see to your left, the diagram, it shows how across the coast of the United States, the frequency of tidal flooding has increased over the past decade significantly. And then to your right, several of the pictures shows how the current tidal flooding are starting to affect the transportation systems. Like these are photos provided by the public in the Hawaii Sea Grand King Tide project, showing tidal flooding on the road, on the sidewalks, in the parking lot. Next slide. So with the tidal flooding, we already say how it's affecting the transportations, but with the projected sea level rise, it's just going to affect the transportation system much more frequently and more severe. So the projection says there could be 3 to 9 times more frequent tidal floodings because of the sea level rise in the past 5 decades. And then with the projected sea level rise, future tidal floodings will exacerbate the current negative impacts on transportation system. That's already happening. So to the bottom, 3 of the photos show how the current tidal floodings are already causing delays, disruptions, road closures in Hawaii. Next slide. So there's many transportation vulnerability studies has been conducted related to try to estimate, project the future sea level rise impacts on transportation systems. So beginning with identifying what are the vulnerable physical facilities, infrastructures, to more systematically study what does that mean for the system disruptions or travel delays across the whole transportation system in recent years. However, there's lack of studies about the already happening nuisance flooding, tidal flooding, which is a kind of a mirror for what's going to happen in future with the sea level rise. And also this lack of consideration of travelers' concerns or their sensitivities to such impacts. And then not to mention about how to consider this from the equity perspective. So that's the goal of our research, trying to bridge this gap and then to say, how could we better understand what does it mean for the travelers, for the different communities in terms of transportation vulnerability that's already happening today. And then what's the implementations when we try to take that to adapt to sea level rise in future. Next. So in our study, we use a measure of accessibility as a measure of transportation vulnerability because there's the ability of accessibility concepts to capture the relationship between land use and transportation, the spatial separations, between different communities and then destinations, as well as the needs of the travelers. So in the past, accessibility has been widely used in disaster studies, like for example, posters, earthquake studies, and then for evaluating flooding impacts, or more recently about potential sea level rise impacts. Next. So there are many accessibility index, and one of the most commonly used adopted ones are the housing accessibility index. So in our study, we adopted the normalized housing accessibility index. We didn't use the weighted ones because we try to approach this from an equal opportunity perspective, avoiding having too much weight for places with many populations. So we use a normalized housing accessibility index to assess the 8 different accessibilities like employment, K-12 schools, university, grocery, recreation, emergency response, like fire station, hospital, and police stations. And then we also realized that in terms of the accessibilities, the ability to reach the destination and the cost related to that is one same, but then on the other hand, people has different type of needs. They are more socially vulnerable communities, populations than the others in terms of needs for emergency facilities or needs for schools or employment. So we also consider 6 social vulnerability index in our studies, like population density, the amount of children, the percentage of children, percentage of elderly, as well as the household without car access or percentage of household below poverty levels. We consider all these indicators as accessibility indicators and how these accessibility are going to be affected by tidal floodings, as well as the social vulnerability indicators in their traffic analysis zone level. And then we use our non-parametric clustering techniques and mean shift clustering methods help us to look at how does communities differ from each other with consideration of all these aspects. Next slide, please. Yeah, so to approach that, at first we use GIS to overlay the flooding maps. We look at historical records of tidal flooding, and then we estimate what are the levels for a 1% annual flood existence probability rate. And then we use that as a threshold to identify the king tide events. With that, we overlay that with the transportation facility maps, and then identify 1%, only 1% of the roadways are actually affected by tidal floodings. Next slide. We also analyze the critical infrastructures like hospital, fire station, police station, as well as the other like business, grocery stores, park and recreations, which one of these will be affected by tidal flooding. And then we first start with assessing the baseline accessibility without floodings. So for the baseline, we can say that the baseline accessibility is already unevenly distributed and it differs across different trip purposes. So without tidal flooding, we can see in these maps, the darker the color is, the better the accessibility is. So groceries and recreational, park and recreational accessibility are the best among all these trips, but they are also the one with greatest regional disparities. Next slide. So with tidal flooding, with the projected impacts on the transportation roadway, critical infrastructure, we assessed in percentage how the accessibility are going to reduce for these different communities, like in terms of their ability to travel to their destinations by different purposes. We can say that some of the communities, such as in the North Shore area, or in the East Wahoo area, or the central Honolulu, city of Honolulu area, they are going to be affected much more than the other communities, but also it differs across different trip purposes. So in general, with tidal flooding, university trips, employment, grocery, and hospitals are most affected, and recreational accessibility is least affected. Next slide. So we also map out, so with this understanding of accessibility and how it's going to reduce with tidal flooding, we also map out the distribution of socially vulnerable populations, like population density, young population, elderly population, household without car, and below poverty levels. We can see there's a significant difference for the community's capabilities or needs for different resources. Next slide. So with these 8 accessibility types and 8 accessibility reductions, as well as 6 of social vulnerability indicators, we try to let the data tell us like how does the community differs. So we use the mean shift clustering methods, break the TAZs. It tells us it actually falls into 31 clusters. We identified that majority of them are the ones that has minimum or moderate reductions in accessibilities. So they are the ones being affected least. And then the remaining 30 clusters has over 100 TAZs. And then we can group them into 6 categories, like depending on the baseline accessibility reductions and then clustering of vulnerable populations. So we only pay attention to the top 2, which is that they have very low baseline accessibilities, but high reductions, as well as clustering of vulnerable populations. Next slide. And then for the first 2, we prioritize them for adaptations based on their baseline accessibility. Like if they have extremely low baseline accessibility, we prioritize them. And then second, by their accessibility reductions, if they have a very low baseline accessibility and very huge reductions, then they are high priorities. And then following that will be their needs for emergency services. We identify socially vulnerable populations, that clustering has a very high clustering of socially vulnerable populations as a third priority. With that, we break the 30 TAZs into 7 categories, 7 tiers, and then the darker the color is, means the more vulnerable they are. Next slide. So through this research, we developed a methodology that can implement trying to incorporate the equity perspective, as well as more detailed vulnerability assessments to help understand where our people are vulnerable and why they are more vulnerable and who they are. So some of the conclusions we have in general, although the amount of facility being affected is less, but then their impacts are much more significant because of its large scale, and also it's all happening at the same time. So there's uneven distribution of impacts, not only regionally, but also across different accessibility types. So although these are challenges imposed by tidal flooding or the future sea level rise, but they are not new problems. These are new threats, but they are actually making the old problems worse. So as we can see in the accessibility analysis, vulnerability analysis, we can see some of the existing problems of the current systems, such as a mismatch between job and then housing, or the limited resources, limited community facilities in the remote rural areas, or the lack of mixed-use development in the suburban communities. These are actually the root causes for these vulnerabilities. And they're old problems, they're just making worse by the incoming climate change and sea level rise. So with that, we propose that it is very important to consider integrate land use planning with transportation adaptations together to address its root causes. And also it's also very important to increase awareness of the preparedness, not only for schools, emergency facilities, but also for businesses, and then through strategies such as preposition of emergency assets, or develop alternative routes beforehand for communities that cannot relocate, have limited abilities to relocate, and then also plan distribution and deliver of services before and after flooding. Okay, next slide, Mac. Okay, so finally, we want to acknowledge the support from the Pacific Southwest region University Transportation Center for their support to enable us to conduct this interesting research. Thank you. And my co-author, Karl Kim, Professor Karl Kim, will talk about other projects.
I apologize. I think we're way over time. I have about 40 slides and I was planning to go for about 10 minutes. I'll try to do it in 5, but I think we're still way over schedule. What I hope to do in this presentation is connect some of the research that Suwan has been describing with the themes of today's conference. Next. Yeah, a lot of the work I do is on safety, on transportation, and then disasters. Next, I direct a FEMA Homeland Security Center that focuses on disaster response and recovery. And a lot of the work that we do is developing and applying different technologies for supporting disaster risk reduction. Next, all of these things, accidents, disasters, share the low probability, high consequence characteristics. And I think that many of the same technologies that we've used for safety can be applied for disasters and catastrophes. Next. Part of this is still about the COVID-19 pandemic, which reminds us of the centrality of transport, because the disease was spread by transportation systems. And even with a vaccine, we're having to resort back to control of our transportation systems. Next. But the main point that I want to emphasize is that the pandemic has really exposed many of the structural weaknesses and inequities in society. And I think it reminds us of the importance of this topic. Next. Part of the work that we've been focusing on is a whole range of different types of strategies involving contact tracing and testing and tracking and different types of technology and training to address this problem of the pandemic. Next slide. And I think that there are ongoing implications for transportation that emerge out of this disaster. I mean, the equity concerns, vulnerable populations, and then the types of strategies that we can adopt to address these challenges. Next slide. And part of what we are researching, we have kind of a quasi-experimental design where we can look at the effects of shutting down our economies to tourism and then the reopening of it and what the impacts are related to the spread of disease and so forth. Next. Yeah, as I think Eric mentioned, there have been increasing reports and studies out talking about the complexities and the changes that we're experiencing globally and then having impacts upon states and localities. Next. Among the things that we're focused on right now is the rapid intensification of wind as a new kind of phenomenon that affects our modeling and our prediction and warning systems. Next. In part of between weather and climate, I think there's climate variability. So a lot of our research right now has been focusing on ENSO effects as a kind of a mid-range spatially and temporally with real significant impacts on transportation systems. Next. And I think in terms of adaptation strategies, I think it involves improving the data, integrating some new technology, big emphasis on serving vulnerable at-risk populations. Next. And so a lot of our work at our center involves trying to use all of these diverse technologies, which we've been applying for coastal hazard mitigation and adaptation, and then re-engineering them for the pandemic and other types of disasters and hazards. Next. And so part of our work in terms of adaptation is we've been strapping these video cameras to monitor sea level rise and coastal changes, and then using that in terms of predicting when and where the hazard threats are the greatest. Next. More recently, we had some large storms. I think Eric did a good job of summarizing the past year. And so because we're a national center, we're trying to apply these technologies. So I want to talk about some of the recent work we've done with Hurricane Ida. Next. And part of this is tied to the work with FEMA that we do with supporting the work related to public and individual assistance. Next. And I think part of what we're trying to do with this is to focus on the vulnerable at-risk populations, looking at where children and the elderly and next, and other at-risk underserved populations are located. Next. And then relating this back to improvements in terms of our estimates of where damage is occurring, and then overlaying these vulnerable at-risk populations. Next. And then using this to estimate debris and other harm that occurs from disasters. Next. And so what we've done is send our assessment teams to actually collect data. And among the most interesting work that we're doing is using Google Street View imagery to capture the baseline conditions, and then using the same cameras and recreating the imagery. Next slide. And so the top image shows the imagery that we collected, and then relating that to the existing Google Street View imagery. And so we built this platform for sharing information on this for damage assessment and so forth. Next slide. And obviously we're trying to relate this to the estimates of storm surge and other estimates to improve the data collection that we're doing. Next. And then tying it to the various modeling efforts that we have, and to see whether or not our prediction models are working. Next. And then, of course, the best sensors are the human ones. And so trying to integrate social media and crowdsourcing into this work. Next. And then so we have a lot of work that's going on integrating social media as another source of data to confirm the analyses, but also to gain additional insights into what's happening at the ground level. And next. And so a lot of the work that we're doing, the development work, it involves combining machine vision and machine learning and deep learning algorithms to help with classification issues. Next. But of course, if you remember the false alarm in Hawaii a few years ago, technology does introduce additional challenges. Next slide. And so one way of doing this is to try to use more nature-based solutions. So a lot of the work that we're doing focuses on living shorelines and designing with nature and other types of planning interventions and alternatives to seawalls and other things which destroy the natural processes. Next. And part of this involves trying to look for the mutual benefits across different hazards and threats. So we're looking at riverine flooding, tsunami, hurricane, sea level rise, and then estimating the harm that comes from these different types of hazards. Next. And then again, as Suwan mentioned, focusing on critical infrastructure exposure. Next slide. And also improving guidance for evacuation to shelters. We don't want to direct people to dangerous locations or have them travel through flooded areas. Next. And a big emphasis is really focusing on persons with medical conditions and at high risk. Next slide. And again, a lot of our work focuses on how we can design systems to be more natural. And next slide. And what this is a slide of a project that I've studied, which is an elevated highway in Seoul, Korea, that was taken down, and they created a stream. This is sort of a first generation nature-based solution. I think there's lots we can learn from this and improve in terms of the design. Next. And so again, a big part of our research right now involves the challenging area of developing nature-based solutions. And so we're doing that in test locations throughout Hawaii and throughout the country. Next. I do think that there are opportunities for collaboration. We are a national center, and we develop and deliver training courses. And so we're always looking for partners. We have a big emphasis right now on evacuation and wildfire evacuation, but also other sorts of nature-based solutions. And I think that there really needs to target underserved minority and tribal communities. And so, and I think my final slide is next. Yeah, so if there's, I know I went through this way too quickly, but again, I'm trying to keep us on time. So if I can follow up, please feel free to contact me, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Karl. Interesting to hear about some of your innovative data collection methods and adaptation solutions. And Suwan, really appreciate your presentation, and I think there's some nice ties to what Eric was talking about in terms of measuring some of the structural inequities that he talked about in terms of lack of access to services, and kind of building those into your analysis of how to prioritize. So thanks for that great example. So our next presentation is going to be a little different. It's going to be on a project done for Caltrans on the vulnerability of California state highway system to wildfire. And the researchers looked at not just physical measures of vulnerability and hazard exposure, but also where different populations might be more vulnerable to wildfire or having access cut off. So we're going to hear from Jim Thorne, an analyst in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at UC Davis, and Jason Whitney, a PhD student in the Geography graduate group, also at UC Davis. And I'm not sure which one's kicking off. Jason, are you kicking us off?
I'll kick us off and give you the quick organization. So we're going to share the presentation, and Jason's going to do the first half of it, and then I'll have a few slides at the end, and I'll add some commentary that's relevant to the conversation that we've had so far. So with that, Jason, go for it.
All right, thanks. We kind of got squeezed into the lunch break, so I'll try to go fast. So yeah, thanks Mike and everybody else. Today, it's really been interesting to participate. So yeah, let's see here. Okay. So I worked on this last year. I have a background in environmental science, environmental justice research. Last year, I worked as a graduate student researcher with Dr. James Thorne, working with these GIS models and maps, and performing interviews with Caltrans staff to ground our work with what's happening in the field. So I'll be presenting some of our work on the analysis of priority vegetation treatment to reduce wildfire risk in California's state highway system. Next slide, please. So briefly, I'll just go over this. So I'll cover our motivation, give a description of our project, introduce our team, cover vegetation management in the right of way, And yeah, you can see the rest. Let's just move on so we get time for the content of it. Okay, the state highways in California are very essential for emergency access, evacuation, fire control lines. The defensible space zone and right-of-way are critical components of this. In California in 2020, there were 42 wildfires that affected the California state highway system. For California state of emergency proclamations by Governor Newsom, and yeah, a huge amount of money is being spent on fire disaster relief and recovery. Next slide, please. Caltrans. Next slide. Caltrans is working proactively to partner to assess and reduce wildfire risk to highway operations before wildfire. They're also refining their mitigation risk reduction measures across divisions as the intensity and complexity of wildfire incidents escalate. Caltrans also emphasizes weather responsive management strategies and incorporates that into their wildfire management plan. Next slide. So our project consisted of several parts. We initially provided an update to a fire risk assessment model produced in 2019 by AV Resource Group. Our update included new data when available. We also selected maps of vegetation structure, climate change pressures, wildfire perimeter, and then developed a framework to use a risk-based prioritization of the road segments with these other data to further refine priority right-of-way areas for fuels and risk reduction. Also interviewed Caltrans staff about obstacles and opportunities to increase the pace and scale of the right-of-way vegetation treatments. Next. So here's our team that worked on this project. I believe some are also in this workshop besides Jim. Next, please. Okay, so the impetus for this current formulation of the Caltrans vegetation control program was established in 1992 by the Programmatic Environmental Impact Report, which outlines management methods for over 250,000 miles of right-of-way in California's 15,000 plus miles of highway. The PEIR was initially developed as part of a plan to reduce herbicide application and analyze 6 options. The integrated vegetation management program was determined to have the least impact, and that was selected. Next slide. So multiple objectives of vegetation control were outlined in the programmatic EIR. I won't be covering each one individually, but you can see they cover quite a range. I will go over some of the challenges we identified in our interviews with Caltrans employees at headquarters in multiple districts. The primary concern is that the roadways are dangerous. There's an incentive to limit the amount of time workers spend on or near a roadway. There are also hiring challenges where it's difficult to find qualified employees for critical positions. For example, regions like the Bay Area, which has a very high cost of living, but the state does not have a cost of living adjustment for Caltrans employees. Part of the strength of how Caltrans is organized into districts is that each district can be specialized to respond to conditions unique to that district. However, this can also create management challenges. For example, some districts have a GIS layer of the right-of-way map and others do not. Additionally, while Caltrans' goal operationalize the products from mapping projects like ours and tracking progress was mentioned as a challenge. Communication between groups was also identified as an area for improvement that can help facilitate more effective vegetation management. There's also overlapping directives of Office of Roadside Management and Office of Emergency Management, which can create operational challenges. So let's see. In addition to the challenges already mentioned, there are changing condition due to climate change, leading to more drought and more invasive species to control. And that also creates challenges with herbicide application methods, as some of the herbicides require rain to really be effective to reduce the fire risk. In terms of the goals and establishment of the PEIR, these alternative control methods are more expensive than herbicide application. And in a resource scarce environment, to meet the goals of wildfire risk reduction, herbicide application has become more heavily relied upon. And if Caltrans is to be consistent with the chosen alternative as laid out in the 1992 PEIR in these changed climatic conditions, more resources and planning that's adapted to these changing conditions is recommended. Okay, next slide. So the GIS analysis here we used spatial data layers, weightings of these layers that had been established by the California Forest Management Task Force and Caltrans as being relevant for wildfire vulnerability and equity. So if we think about vulnerability of wildfire in this way through the lens of equity, in order to do that, we factored in these elements, which are included. You can see in the left there, the census factors: families in poverty, people with disabilities, people that have difficulty speaking English, people over 65, people under 5, households without a car, and housing density. And that established 22% of the effective model weighting. CAL FIRE layers were 23%, USDA 27%, and Caltrans 28%. These were established as part of the response to the catastrophic fires in California. And these social factors were defined by the governor's office in integrated study circa 2018. So we could also consider how we could overlay contextual data that can help give additional information when looking at these priority segments. Next slide. So in our GIS analysis workflow, we used the 2019 input layers and updated that with the 2020 data to create a priority raster. We then used the state highway vector layer to buffer, overlay, and extract the data table of priority index values, calculated priority range classes for each post-mile interval, and then gave an output of a segmented highway network map and tables of range classes. Next slide. So on the left, we have 2020 priority routes in red at the same 17% standard that was set by the 2019 model. And on the right is the visualization of the differences between the 2019 and 2020 models. So 2020 is in red, 2019 in blue, where they overlap in yellow. The 2020 model used the same weights for each of the layers, but with updated data. One can envision how a similar map could be made where we do another analysis where we modeled the priority routes both with and without the equity factor to see how including the equity factors impacted the results. We could also consider how to incorporate factors that address environmental justice concerns, perhaps by including data layers from Cal EnviroScreen in the analysis. Next slide, please. So the map-based approach provides an opportunity for both targeting areas and a framework for tracking work progress. For example, if initial targeting roadside fire risk could be, you could set target objectives. So in this example, you could think of each 10% tranche representing a 3 to 5 year plan. Overall miles per district can be allocated to highest priority locations, and then objectives for a given year can be modified by local expertise. Footprints of wildfire and history of what areas have been treated. Next slide. So we can visualize the results by district. The districts in the north have much larger area priority centerline miles, and those are heavily forested. Next slide. So we can see the same results by graphically and by route number. Next slide. So we're also able to look at the overlap with different partners and tribal lands. Next. National forests comprise a large part of the priority map, priority miles. Next slide. State parks as well. Next slide. So those types of visualizations can help serve as tools to engage stakeholders and solidify partnerships. And so we can see, for example, District 4 also has a large number of centerline miles. And some of the workshops that we held last year were also focused on District 4. Okay, I think I managed to speed through my part. Jim, I think you're up.
Okay, yeah, thanks for doing that, Jason. And so you can see that the top 10, 20, 30%, that could be calibrated to the actual funds or capacity that a region has, right? Because we're limited by how much we could actually go do in terms of reducing wildfire risk. And by reducing wildfire risk, we're talking about roadside treatments to reduce the amount of vegetation in the right-of-way, in the areas that Caltrans actually manages across those 15,000 miles of linear highway. So additionally, so the framework itself, I think, is quite useful, and it's one that Caltrans uses internally for many other purposes, using a 0.1 mile segments of its entire network to look at various different types of needs and maintenance projects, planning and maintenance projects. Here we can take the output from our vegetation analysis and we can get more context by bringing in other types of data to it. So here now we've overlaid it with wildfire perimeters, and you can see that wildfires are indeed happening even in some of the most populated parts of the state. Next slide. And we can leverage increasingly available remote sensing imagery. In this case, it's surface fuels. So this is a summer 2020 measure of the amount of surface fuels that are in different places, and where you see a saturated blue next to a red highway line, those might be places that are particularly high priority. Next slide. Another measure of that is a canopy bulk density, which is not the fuel on the ground, but the amount of burnable material from stem to top of trees in different locations. So the more saturated those locations are, also could be a way to prioritize. The next slide. And then we have climate change exposure. And so I'm going to step you through using what I think is probably a realistic scenario for the Bay Area. It's a hot and dry climate projection, a global climate model, and it's on the RCP 8.5, which is the more aggressive version of the future. And one thing that we learned with many interactions with natural resource managers is it doesn't matter if we're able to reduce emissions over the longer term. In the immediate term and in the planning horizon for forest management, for example, they have to deal with the next 30 years. And so, planning or trying to address the worst impacts is the most conservative approach that you can take. And something like reaching a global agreement on emission reduction, global change mitigation is something that's beyond the capacity of the individual manager to address. And so therefore, they should be looking at it. So what I want to draw your attention to on this series of images is see how much the yellow and the brown and the orange expand as we go to the next slide, which is out to 2040, and then the slide after that to 2070, and then the slide after that to 2100. And so what you can see is that the areas that have high stress for the existing vegetation, let alone fires, let alone any other extreme types of events, those areas expand tremendously. And so for something like a permanent infrastructure, getting ahead of the game by recognizing that this is the longer term horizon and bringing that into the local planning in the next 5 years is potentially quite helpful in terms of developing that longer term persistence. Next slide. And indeed, our project leader on this in Caltrans, Lisa Worthington, has already recognized the many challenges that are involved with this. And Karl mentioned the need to go cross-boundary, across administrative boundary. Well, Caltrans is very familiar with that because it needs to engage with landowners on the private side, which you see on the left-hand side of this graphic, or with federal land management agencies like the Forest Service on the right-hand side, because just treating the right-of-way when you're facing wildfires in, under 40, 50 mile an hour winds is not going to be sufficient to really abate that risk. And it needs to be expanded out from the right-of-way, the control zone of Caltrans, into adjoining landscapes. And those adjoining landscapes then require engagement with stakeholders that represent a wide range of interests and a wide range of vulnerabilities. So that cross-boundary, just even mapping those cross-boundary risks, I think is a helpful approach. And in our next slide, we had a series of, Lisa was engaged with a series of meetings with stakeholders in the East Bay. You can see the little black box on the right-hand image there, and then that's what you're seeing in the large image here, looking at Route 24. And so we had some priority vegetation treatment areas that showed up along this Highway 24. And here you also see in the background the rest of the street that are in this area. Next slide. And if we look at those in combination with the surface fuels, we can start to get an idea of, if there was a large wildfire that ripped through this area, there would be a need to get onto Highway 24. And so it's in terms of the vegetation treatment, there's the access to the evacuation route itself then becomes sort of this fractal challenge of how do we address that within these communities. Next slide. And if we look at that from a climate risk perspective, we see that some parts of the highway are actually in areas that are more climate stable with regards to the vegetation will stay within some level of suitability stress, but there are large parts of the region that enter into higher levels of stress by the end of century. So on this image, before I go to my last slide, I want to just make a couple other comments that tie us back to the conversations that we've been having. In terms of working with nature, what we hear from the natural resource management side is that they need lenses that give relative risk across the landscape to allow the tools that we've already developed for risk reduction and for treatments to be applied, but bringing in a climate change risk perspective. And then there are ways of mapping this that might be helpful for transportation agencies, but that go beyond just the agency. We're working on a project here with CAL FIRE, mapping all the urban forests in California across all urban areas. And this will be our second iteration of that. And we're doing that, and it allows for a prioritization of where to do plantings in disadvantaged communities, what areas are, and in that one, we're bringing in Cal EnviroScreen. We're looking at where you could reduce heat island effects, where you might get better particle interception by plantings within urban areas. And then there's the sort of the contrasting side of, yeah, we need to plant to address immediate needs within these neighborhoods, but we also need to be looking at the safety concerns of a broader scale view. And there's tools that can come from conservation biology that might be interesting, such as Omniscape. And we've done a big study with a couple of different cities in Asia where we're looking at the connectivity of open space within urban areas. And there's also the idea of where will future urban areas be if there will be new growth, and how do we situate those so that entire counties or entire areas are the most climate resilient? And that ties into transportation planning and evaluation of food security, evaluation of water security, evaluation in this case of safety from wildfire. And so I think that there's a great deal of opportunity for the integration of natural resource management approaches with this concept of social equity, with the concept of we need to develop sustainability at watershed scales and across larger areas. So with those comments, I'll pass it back to Mike. Oh, and the last slide. Thank you. And thanks to our sponsors, the NCST funding, and to Caltrans for permitting us to work on this project.
Great. Thanks so much, Jim and Jason, for that presentation, sharing your work with us. And hopefully this has given everyone a couple of more kind of concrete examples of how some of these measures of social vulnerability can be interwoven into project analyses that you're doing or prioritization efforts. And I did want to just mention that, you know, this technical analysis, and I think, you know, both groups alluded to this, the technical analysis isn't necessarily a replacement for going out and talking to the communities and getting to know the communities and their needs that you're serving. And I suspect we're going to be hearing more about that in our next session with practitioners. So with that, we've got just a couple minutes for a question or two, maybe. And there was a question earlier on in regards to Suwan and Karl's presentation about your work and on flooding on Oahu and generalizability and the extent to which that type of method could be applied to maybe other regions and even other climate threats. And Jim and Jason, I give you an opportunity to weigh in too on kind of this GIS exercise that you did and its applicability to maybe thinking about other types of climate threats as well.
Yes, so I put in the chat message. So the methodology definitely can be applied and repeated for other type of hazards as well as different geographical scales. So our data source comes from the CTPP, the census data set. It's available nationwide, but also it can also be done at, for example, block group level or track level.
Yeah, and I think that there's real interest in trying to combine together satellite imagery, drone imagery, air photos, all the land use cadastral files, in addition to the census data. We've been working really closely with Google Street View just because it is so ubiquitous, at least in the United States, and then acquiring the same cameras that Google uses to recreate the 360-degree imagery. And then, of course, it's very important to link this to other sources of information that are in more real time, because we want to know for our work, especially if there's a hurricane or tsunami or some other event like even a wildfire, who's most impacted, because that really affects the response and operations and so forth. So having baseline data, but then more real-time systems for integrating this, I think is really part of the effective response, and actually long-term recovery too. So,
and I think from our end, the study we presented was focused on a planning and management application within a transportation agency, right? So I think the framework is quite translatable, and recognizing sort of the area of responsibility that an agency has then allows you to have this kind of a spatial framework, which can then be, you can both assess risk. I think ours was more of a long-term risk, but saying, hey, we want to try to abate that risk. I think there's also the opportunity to say there's places that have really low risk, and you could plant trees along some of the major interstates because you want to also be reducing your carbon footprint. But then there's the emergency type of a situation, which has its own set of criteria. And so there's sort of, and I liked your time line that you flashed on one of those images of, hey, we have the immediate things, and sometimes that's emergency, and then we have the sort of the midterm, which is we want to risk abatement and we want to start building for future resilience, and then we have a longer term component. And then all of those may be intersecting vertically across issues of social equity and to help to prioritize both across, in our case, across the state and within districts. How do we prioritize? And we can weight those more heavily to bring in the disadvantaged communities, the areas that are at higher risk in that way. So I think that's how we tie into what you were just describing.
Thank you. There are a couple other questions I'd love to ask, but we're running up against it. So I want to thank all of our speakers in this last session. Great job. Really appreciate you sharing your work with us. And we now have a short lunch break. So we'll invite everyone you can stay logged in if you want, or log off and log back in. But we're going to pick up our session 3, which will be with our roundtable of our practitioners at 12:40 p.m. So you got about half an hour to take a lunch break, and we will see you back at 12:40. Thanks so much.